Hello everyone, this is our next video and series on talking about lesson planning. This one is on assessments, so this is the third in the series. So if you haven't watched the first video on introductions and foundations or the second video on objectives, you may want to go back and rewatch those or watch those if you haven't yet, and make sure you have all that material sort of squared away. We're going to be talking a lot about material that are in those first two, so if you haven't seen them or if it's been a while or just a little bit of review, you may want to go back and look at those. But in this video, we'll be talking about assessments in all their various forms and then tying them into an actual lesson plan. So let's begin. So just like in the previous videos, very quickly want to talk about an overview of what we're going to be talking about in this video. So we're going to be defining the varying levels, uses, and approaches to assessment. So assessment comes in a lot of different forms, and so you may have a narrow idea of what we mean by assessment. You probably have some ideas, some notions about what assessment is, but it might be a little bit limited. So we want to open that up and see all the different ways in which we can use and plan and make the most of our assessment opportunities. So that's going to be the first thing we're going to do. Then we're going to start connecting this video's material with the previous video's material. So we're going to start to tie together very explicitly objectives and assessments and how these two things fit together. And then the third thing, we'll start to look through a more developed lesson plan that is going to make the most of both of these ideas. So I picked a topic and we'll kind of go through how I might put together the first couple steps of a lesson plan. So you can kind of see some of these ideas and some of my thinking around these ideas kind of put into practice. So that's what we're going to be doing. And again, you'll hopefully notice that our objectives for this video, we can call them what they are really, these are our objectives, are what I said I was going to do for next time in the previous video. So we're carrying these ideas over. Last time I said this is what we're going to do next time. Well, now this is next time, so we're doing it. All right, so let's get started. Well, it's really important that we look at these two terms, assessment and evaluation, and understand how they're the same, but also really how they're different. And you will hear a lot of people, including teachers, use these two terms interchangeably. And it's really important that you understand that they're not really interchangeable. Certainly there's some overlap, but they are not synonymous by any stretch of the imagination. Um, so let's talk about how the two terms sort of like how we can understand them individually, and then how they're the same, but also how they're not the same. So an assessment is anything that we do that helps us better understand what's going on in terms of the learning in our classroom. And we might use that assessment to help students learn better. That's probably the biggest cause that we want to use for assessment, because students should be first in our classroom. But we can also use assessment to help us better understand our teaching. So there are going to be times where, if one or two students get a question wrong, we need to understand how to help those students. But if, we do something and everyone gets it wrong, it's not on them. The more students who get something wrong, the more it's on us as the teacher. And we have to have the, humility to say, like, okay, well, if everyone got that wrong, that's a bad question or a bad task, or I didn't teach that very well. So sometimes we can use assessments as a reflective piece to help us do a better job as teachers. Sometimes assessment is going to be used to relate information to parents, guardians, principals, superintendents, department chairs, whomever. So assessment is going to be used a lot of different ways for a lot of different reasons, a lot of different purposes, but it's all about understanding what's going on, the learning in our classroom. Now, evaluation is a slightly different animal. Evaluation is once we start making some sort of judgment on that assessment. Again, I want to try really hard not to use the word evaluate in the definition of evaluation. But once I start assigning some sort of measure to that, once I start to give it a number, start to give it a letter, once start, this is a green, this is a yellow, this is a red. Once I start to do that sort of practice on something, then it goes beyond being an assessment into an evaluation. So when a lot of times people think about assessment, they think about homework, they think about quizzes, they think about exams, and those are all assessments, but they are more strictly evaluations. Those are things where typically you get a grade back on it. You turn in a homework, someone grades it, teacher, another student, whatever, it comes back to you, there's a number. If it's typically if this number's big, you feel pretty good about what you did, and if the number's pretty low, then okay, this is no good. And so that those homeworks start to fold into quizzes, which fold into exams, which fold into larger exams. And those are certainly all assessments, but they are a very narrow scope of assessment. These are assessments that are more strictly evaluations. You can probably figure out that most evaluations are built on assessments. It's very rare that you get an evaluation where there's just a number or a letter given seemingly out of thin air. Now, we'll talk here in just a moment about formal versus informal. And so, there's some times where it may seem out of thin air, but it's very much not. But most evaluations are going to be built on assessments. The other direction of that is not the case. The converse is not always true. Every assessment does not have to become an evaluation. So we'll talk more in this video about how that's the case, but certainly make sure you understand the difference between these two, how they interrelate, but also how they're very, very different. And please, please, please don't use these two terms interchangeably. So there are two main types of assessment that we're going to talk about today, and the first one is formative assessment. And formative assessment is assessment that's done within the instructional unit, and I'll explain what that means. So in the course of a lesson, these are things that I'm going to do during the course of teaching that help me make good decisions about what's going on. Are students following what's going on? Are they completely lost? Do they know this all already? What I don't want to do is write a 55-minute script and go in and deliver that script. And if students are lost, I keep going. And if they already know what's going on and they know what I'm going to do 10 minutes from now, then I just keep going. That's less teaching and more just sort of demonstrating. It's like lecture, but just all the worst forms of and the worst ideas of lecture. As I'm teaching, I want to be gathering this information about how are things going. Are students picking this up? Are they not? Do I need to speed up? Do I need to slow down? Do I need more examples? Do I need fewer examples? Am I just absolutely beating this thing into the ground and they understood it 4 minutes ago? Like, what's going on? So there should be some sort of give and take in your teaching with your students about what's going on, rather than just going through it and teaching the same if there were students in the room or if there were not students in the room. We've all had those teachers. We know what that looks like. We're trying not to do that because it's not very effective teaching. The other side of this is summative assessment. And summative assessment typically takes place after the instructional unit. And so this is going to make me think more about the planning piece that comes next. So this is, again, like I said in the previous slide, what we think of in terms of evaluation. So a summative assessment might be a homework that I do on Monday night. So when students come back on Tuesday, I get a better idea of how Monday went. It's summative to Monday. So once I have that, that helps me make some decisions about maybe how Tuesday is going to go, how Wednesday is going to go, how much depth I can cover, how much breadth I can get into in the material. So this summative piece is going to help me think more about what's going on in the future. It's not necessarily stuff that is going to help me make change in the moment, because homework is typically done outside of class. So this doesn't really fit too well with what we think of as formative assessment. The line between these two is a little blurry. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But this is typically the two main types of assessment that we talk about and that we're going to talk about in this video. So I wanted to pull this slide back from a previous video to talk a little bit more clearly about sort of this formative and summative piece. So this increased effectiveness wedge down at the bottom, the brown, or not the brown, the blue one. So that is a lot of where that summative piece is going to be, and especially as it ties into that planning piece. So once I've gathered this summative information, then I can start to make better ideas about sort of the plans going forward. Now, granted, if I assign the homework on Monday, students do it Monday night, they bring it back to class on Tuesday. I might not have as much time to make changes as far as Tuesday goes as I might like, but it does help me think about Wednesday, Thursday, Friday into next week, into the exam, into the next assignments. So, there's varying levels of how much time I have to really work with and process what I get from that summative information, but it does give me some ideas of what's going on and how we've sort of met the goals of that instructional unit. Um, if I start to learn on Tuesday morning that students really didn't understand what we tried to get done on Monday, then I gotta go back. I may have to reteach and hit some stuff again on Tuesday that we did on Monday. That's part of it. The formative assessment piece is really within that green wedge, that teach section. That's within the lesson, that's within the moment, that's within that instructional unit. And so that's going to be there. So these two pieces, the formative and summative, are sort of in different parts of the planning cycle. And since we looked at this image before, I thought I'd bring it back to sort of illustrate where these pieces fit. It's also important to separate out the difference between what we talk about as formal and informal assessments. And these kind of correlate to formative and summative a little bit, at least in terms of how people tend to think about assessments. But when we talk about a formal assessment, this is the more sort of high stakes, pencil and paper. You're doing this, and if you don't do well, you're gonna notice. And this could go from getting a low grade on a homework all the way up to MCAs, SATs, ACTs, LSATs, whatever. Those are really formal assessments, obviously on a continuum of how formal they are. But a lot of times when we think about assessments, like I said, people think about evaluations, and they're thinking about evaluations as formal assessments. The other side of the coin is the informal assessment, and these are the ones that I was talking about earlier, where teachers who do them really well, it's very easy to miss that they're doing them. And so one form of an informal assessment would be questions that get asked in class. Um, so not every assessment needs to be, all right, everyone get quiet, take out a piece of paper, write these things down. That takes a lot of time. You certainly argue that you're going to get more and better information from that type of assessment. But then there's a flow sort of issue with that. You have to kind of stop your instruction. There's a transition from the instruction into the assessment. There's another transition from the assessment back into the instruction. So it can be a little clunky to make that work. There's a trade-off. You get better information, but you've lost some momentum in order to get it. Sometimes you can get maybe, just as good information, or at least just as good relative to the amount of time that you're spending doing an informal assessment. And so asking a really good question. We'll talk about this more in the next video when we think about planning some of these assessment pieces and some of these questions. When you think about the sort of questions that you ask in class, does anyone have any questions? Like that question you always have in your hip pocket, like you don't need to plan that question. But it's also not a great question in a lot of ways. So we want to sort of like sparingly use that sort of question. So if we want to sparingly use that sort of question, then what are the questions that we should be using more frequently? That's a thing that we're going to be working on, a little bit in this video and a lot more in the next video, thinking about what those, good questions are and how to plan good questions. A lot of the questions, they're not evaluative. I ask a question, somebody answers it. I may not even respond if I think it's correct or incorrect. I may just take that response and use it to sort of like move the classroom discourse forward. So it's okay if it's not evaluated. I'm not giving letters and numbers and things to the conversation that takes place in class. I'm collecting it to sort of understand what's going on and to do it quickly, to do it efficiently. So one thing to kind of think about now that we sort of created our axis, when you think of summative, you probably think of formal. At the end of a chapter, you probably think of a test, which is that formal summative assessment. And when you think of, the informal summative assessment, that's what I said. When you think of formative assessment, you probably think of informal. So you probably think of a teacher asking a question. So I want you to sort of like think a little bit about the other two domains. How have you seen informal summative assessment done well? How have you seen formal formative assessment done well? So if you have a pretty clear picture of what two of the four quadrants look like, think about the other two, because we want to use assessment in as broad a way as possible because it gives us more depth of information. So think about those other ways in which you can see assessment done well. So, one of the things we should probably talk about is sort of the motivation for assessments, and I've mentioned this already a little bit. Um, but we do assessments because we want to get good information about student learning and about our teaching. I want you to really be thinking about the pragmatic aspect of your assessment. So it's not just why are we doing assessment, but which assessment am I doing, and when do I do it, and how do I do it, and which types of activities am I using. It's really easy to sort of fall into just a pattern. Teach, homework, teach, homework, teach, homework, exam. Teach, homework, teach homework quiz, teach homework exam. Like it's easy to kind of fall into this thing. But you should be hopefully kind of stepping back almost third person and looking at your lesson plan and your unit plan and trying to figure out like where are good opportunities to do things that give me more and better and different information. If you're doing all the same stuff all the time, then you're probably not stretching yourself in terms of assessment. Um, and if you're not stretching yourself in terms of assessment, then you're probably not getting as broad a scope of information on your student learning as you can and should be. So be thinking about that. Also be thinking about who has access to this information and what are they looking for. What you need is different from what students need, is different from what your principal needs, is different from what parents and guardians need. So be thinking about ways of doing assessments in various ways that sort of like help help meet various people's needs. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. If you're going to have like a parent night at school, then it's not a bad idea to have students work on an assessment that everyone can do. Is very accessible, um, but is good for display. And we think about this a lot as like an elementary or middle school type of thing, but it really applies to high school as well. So if you do an activity, you do an assessment, and you collect it from everybody, or you have the students really hang it up around the classroom, then when parents come in, they have an opportunity to see not only what students generally are working on, but they can see a sample of what their child has done. Um, and I taught middle school, and this was a great thing. Obviously, parents got a lot of engagement out of it. When I went to high school, this was presented to me as an idea, and I felt like, that's really kind of kiddo, but I did it anyway, and I found a lot of parents had a lot of good response to it. And really, what I learned was kind of the opposite of what I suspected. As students get older, parents kind of like get shut out of that conversation a little bit more and more, and they see less and less a lot of times of their child's work. So this thing that they're seeing may be the first like genuine primary artifact that they've seen of their child's work in a while. Students also, as they get older, they become a little bit more independent. They don't want to share their successes as much. A seventh grader probably wants something on the fridge a little bit more than a high school junior or senior on average. Again, I'm speaking in generalities. So I found that high school parents were really interested in seeing this sort of thing. So that is an assessment that's done for parents and guardians in a very specific way. Um, they're getting information in a very different way than the student is getting information or that we're getting information. So now let's start tying this in with objectives like we talked about in the previous video. Um, Three main points that I really want to make about this. Um, if you have an objective, you've written an objective and you kind of go through the lesson plan and then you realize there's not really a good place to assess that objective, then you really have to question whether or not that objective needs to be part of that lesson plan. Um, Hopefully if that objective is crucial, you can find like, a place to put in an assessment. But if that assessment doesn't really ever seem to fit, then that objective probably doesn't fit. And then that instructional piece tied to that objective probably doesn't fit either. So most objectives, when you write them, the assessment sort of follows and makes sense. And where it fits within the lesson sort of follows and makes sense. But if you have an objective and you can't figure out where to assess it, then you need to ask yourself how much you need that objective, or if you need to retool that objective in a way that the assessment does make sense. It's also possible that you write an objective, then you start looking at the assessments for it, and then as you start to plan out that assessment, you realize that objective maybe doesn't cover as much ground as I thought. That assessment makes you realize, well, they also need this and this and this, and so there's more complexity to it. It's really easy sometimes, especially when we're teaching content that we know really well, to sort of forget some of the subtlety and some of the nuance to the material. And we boil it down maybe a little bit too much to maybe like one or two ideas. And then when we do the assessment, we realize, oh, I forgot about, X, Y, and Z. So now I need more objectives that sort of cover X, Y, and Z in a little bit more specific detail. So, be open to that. Writing assessments can often give you insight into your objectives that you didn't have at the time. So be open to going back and sort of reworking those objectives, adding to them, taking away, increasing, decreasing complexity, sort of working with those objectives. So everything fits together in a way that makes sense. The third point is not a very common one, but it does happen. Sometimes you'll see teachers who will plan a very low level, like knowledge-based objective, and then the assessment is really complex. It's analytical or evaluative in nature, and so you are assessing the learning target or the content of that objective, but there's a mismatch in complexity. So if you're going to teach the content at a sort of like lower Bloom level, then it kind of makes sense for the assessment to be at that similar lower Bloom level. We don't want to go through class and be, hitting just knowledge-based stuff, and then students go out and they do the homework and they come back and they go, I understand a word of the homework. Sometimes you hear that complaint. It's because there's a mismatch in complexity level, the problems that you assign. We want them to be a little bit of a stretch, certainly. We want students to be able to sort of take knowledge and go away and apply that knowledge. But if that application starts to stretch a little bit further into analysis, into evaluation, into synthesis, then we're pushing a little bit too far. We got to fill those gaps in between. So just be thinking about that when you're writing your assessments, when you're thinking about your assessments and planning your assessments. So I'm going to go back real quick and revisit, again, this Bloom Teacher Planning Kit. It's on Moodle. Be looking at this, and this should give you some idea in terms of structure, not just for objectives like we talked about before, but for assessments as well. So when you're writing your objectives, you're thinking about the level of the objective. Also be thinking about the level of the assessment and making sure that they fit and that they match. You can see this at the bottom part here where it says questions at the bottom, and this ties more into sort of our informal formative piece, although some of these questions can be developed into homework, quiz, exam type questions, so they can become more formal and more summative. But this sheet is not just helpful in terms of writing objectives, but also helpful in terms of how we think about doing our assessments as well. So be looking at that bottom section of the columns as well. So let's move into sort of a sample lesson plan. And so I picked a topic here that I think most people should have, some working knowledge and familiarity with. Sometimes I pick examples away from mathematics because it's easier for me to think objectively about a topic or content area that's not my own. But the topic I want to look at is exploring the relationship between geography and major cities of the United States. So I'm going to assume that most people have some working knowledge of like the major geographical features of the United States. Specifically, probably we're talking about the contiguous 48, um, and then also major cities of the United States. This topic can be extended. We could do North America, we could do the world. We could even make it a little bit more micro and just talk about Minnesota. But just for the sake of this, again, this is not a content specific course. I just want to be looking at the planning piece of it. So I just picked a topic that I think most people could have some sort of idea of what it means. So you can at least gauge with the content on some sort of level. So three things that I want to be thinking about. First, what are the learning targets that we need in order to start with this topic? So what are the things, what are the building blocks, the foundational pieces? I mentioned before, day one, a lot of knowledge. It might be knowledge, and more knowledge. It might be, knowledge, and a little bit of comprehension. But typically, a vast majority, if not all of day one, probably a big chunk of day two, is just putting the pieces in place or getting students to remember the pieces so we can start to do a little bit more of the higher level work. So what are those learning targets? Next is how do I take those learning targets and turn them into objectives? And then finally, which is sort of the idea behind this video, now how do I start to assess those objectives? The objective is where I want to go. The assessment is how I know I got there. So I want to go through these three steps as I would sort of think about them in doing this topic. So the first thing was, what are the learning targets that we need to start this? And really, I mean, once you write out that statement, it's pretty much right there. Students need to know the geography. So what are the geographical features? Second, the cities. We got to talk about, the cities. We're trying to make a connection between the geography and the cities. So they need to be able to recognize some aspect of the geography and some aspect of the cities. Whether or not I would want to open it up or give them selected certain features. Maybe I want one group of students working on Midwest, one on the East, one on the West, one on the South. I might break it up, in terms of regions, so they're all working on different things. I might just throw out one big map. We're all kind of like looking at it as we see it. I might want to be very, very specific about certain features in certain cities, so we see those connections. I don't want to focus on the Great Lakes and then just look at cities that are, out in the American West, because there's not a lot of connection between the two. How open and how restrictive, and how structured I want to be with it is stylistic and also a function of the students that you're working with. So knowing how well they engage with the content is going to help you make good decisions about, how flexible you can be with this. And then the third thing that they're going to need is some idea of the relationship between the two. And now we're starting to get beyond just the factual pieces, but getting into what do you see, what do you notice, what do you observe. Now we're starting getting into the higher order pieces. So we have two pieces of knowledge, and then a third thing that's like taking these two pieces of knowledge and kind of rubbing up against each other and seeing like if we get any sparks, does anything happen? So these are the three, basic things. So now, if I wanted to write these as objectives, I've already kind of put into my mind, like I just mentioned on the previous slide, not just the learning targets themselves, but sort of structurally how they fit together. So I've got the students will be able to identify the major structural characteristics, elements, features, whatever of the United States. So, rivers, lakes, mountains, whatever, we need those pieces, and those are knowledge pieces. The second piece is going to be the major cities of the United States. Again, however I want to open this up. Do I want to give them specific cities and find these on a map, or tell me what you think of as major cities? However that's going to work. I have those two knowledge pieces. And what I mean by structurally is now I can see how these two pieces that are sort of lateral to each other start to tie together and move up that Bloom pyramid. We've got two knowledge pieces on the bottom of the pyramid, and they tie together to make this comprehension piece. So now, can you start to summarize common characteristics that you see between the geographical features and the location of the selected cities? So there should be some sort of connection that we find, or else this topic is going to be absolutely pointless. Again, how much I want to open this up and steer toward that direction, or specifically pick like one geographical feature. Like, we could do just Great Lakes and look at major cities along the Great Lakes. And then, the question becomes, is that coincidence or by plan? And then we're going to start to move into, obviously, shipping and trade and industry and all these sorts of ideas. So this is setting the stage for a much bigger conversation. But that's what day one, day two kind of do. Like, it's just these little pieces that help set the stage for these more complex ideas and conversations. So this is a comprehension piece. Now, there may be other knowledge pieces that we start to tie into this. So when we start to get into ideas of shipping and trade and economy, so why is Chicago important? What does Chicago or what has it done historically that's made it an economic power, that's made it a place of population growth? Why was Toledo important then? Why is it important now? So there are going to be these knowledge pieces that sort of like tie back into this. So we're not just going to put these two knowledge pieces in and build up from there. There are going to be other knowledge pieces that make this pyramid wider. And then the wider it gets, the taller it can go, the more that we can get into the higher order types of conversation. So yeah, these knowledge pieces, these are not going to be the only two. So now finally, the whole point of this, objectives. So now how am I going to assess that we got there? And so one of the ways I thought would be nice to do this would be to write out both informal and formal aspects of this. So the way I sort of think about the lesson, I would just want to put up a map of the United States and hope that I could find one that is sort of like topographical. We kind of see some of the features, but without names necessarily, and hopefully without some of the state lines and maybe locations of the cities, so we can start to talk about what do we see, and so the what do we see conversation at the beginning is going to be good. It's going to help me get an idea of what students are looking for. Are they only talking about rivers? Are they only talking about lakes? Are they only talking about mountain ranges? Are they forgetting that there's oceans and the Gulf of Mexico, the larger bodies of water that form the eastern and western boundaries of the contiguous 48 at least. So what are students noticing and what are they not noticing? Where are they putting a lot of emphasis and where are they putting not enough emphasis? So again, if I want to do it in this sort of more broad uh, approach, I can certainly do that. I can also say, okay, look, there's 10 features on the board. Let's locate these 10 things. So rather than open it up, I have it be a little bit more structured and say, we're going to look at these 10 or 12 and just kind of pin the tail on the donkey and put these features on the map. And same thing with cities. I can certainly open it up. What are some major cities that we think about? And then, if students start to be a little bit more focused on, maybe local cities, if students start to bring up Mankato before they do Los Angeles, then I need to refocus that conversation a little bit and start to look at various places, making sure that I'm tying the cities to the geography in a way that's going to make sense. Um, so if I'm really pushing Midwestern geographical features and like I said, Western cities, I'm have a hard time doing the third step here. So, I'm kind of steering it in a way that I'm moving in the direction that I want us to be moving, and hopefully doing it in a subtle enough way that students don't notice. It doesn't look too forced. So, I want to get an idea, what students are noticing in terms of the geographical features, and then formative. Like if I want to really make sure that students know where these things are on a map, I'm just going to give them a map. Just here, draw it. Here's some colored pencils, shade in. Here's some markers. Put some dots, whatever. So if I want to see it in a more formal way, it's probably what you would imagine, and probably what you've experienced as a student. Somebody gives you a thing and you do it, and that's it. You can collect that or just go by and look at it. So the formal, informal, a little gray. You can certainly collect it, grade it, make it an evaluative piece. It's very formal. You could just kind of walk around and look and see and give feedback, and that moves a little bit more informal. So the manner in which you want to use that is going to be stylistic, but also a function of the students that you're working with, and you'll know them when they actually exist and what they're capable and what they need. So let's move on to objective 2. which was around the cities. And really, this is almost cut and paste from objective one. I'm going to, probably use the same map and talk about major cities and where are they. Start to put some dots on the map and okay, well, let's look at this and look at this and look at this. And then again, that formal piece, if I need to, here's a map, put some cities on there. Hopefully it's the same map. So then students can start to see a connection. If it's two different maps, it might be a little bit harder to see what's going on. But that's it. It's knowledge, right? So, I mean, it's a low level Bloom task. So the assessment doesn't need to be super complex. If I want to know you can find stuff on a map, I'm going to give you a map and ask you to find it. That's pretty much it. It's really easy to overthink some of this and make it real complex. And that's suitable and appropriate for some higher order Bloom objectives. But the knowledge stuff, if I want to know you know something, I'm going to give you a thing and just have you show me that you know it. That's it. You don't need to reinvent that wheel. We get to objective 3 now. We're moving up in complexity a little bit. We've got a comprehension piece here. And so now, once we've gone through this first bit, and maybe I take the first half or so, maybe a little bit more than half, to look at the map, to talk about geographical features, talk about cities, I might now start to open up a large group discussion, or maybe I have students working, I mentioned working in region groups. So I might have, small group discussion time. So students in the South group, the Midwest group, the East group, the North group, talking about the West group, whatever, within their regions, what do you notice? And so then that small group becomes a large group discussion. So now let's hear from this group, what did you notice? Let's hear from this group, what did you notice? And they're going to start to find that we started to all notice a lot of the same things. We start to all see a lot of the same commonalities. And that's your launching point to the next day. Like that's going to be where you're going into the next day. So the formal or the informal piece could be just that discussion. Now, sometimes I'd be really careful because if the formal summative piece to this, the piece is going to let me know what did we do on today, I don't want to have a discussion that covers everything from that formal summative piece maybe to where a bunch of students go off and just write a transcript of what we talked about in class. So maybe I want to initiate the conversation to make sure that everyone's moving in the right direction, that they've noticed at least a basic level of of commonalities, that they've got some stuff to work on. But I might not want to give away the store. I might not want to say everything in class and go into that. At the same time, you might be okay with that. And then that becomes an informal summative assessment. We talked about it in class. I feel very comfortable that everyone kind of noticed all these same pieces or all these same things. There may be something that's a little bit more formal that's still fairly informal, like an exit slip that doesn't get graded. Tell me what you noticed, and they turn those in. So there's a continuum of things we can do. You probably experience what I experience a lot of times in schools, that this would be you go home and you do homework, quote unquote, and you write out some very formal thing, but it doesn't have to be that. And this is the creative piece of teaching where we get to decide what's going to be the best way to gather this information in a way that makes the students and me feel like we're doing meaningful work rather than just sitting at the kitchen table with a box of crayons and coloring a map because they were told to do it. So, how do we find that tipping point between doing the work that's meaningful and also gives us good information? One last quick thing here, and then we'll be done. So it's really important that we understand that formative and summative assessment really is about context and about time context. Something that is summative to day one is also going to be formative into day two and can be formative within the instructional unit of the whole unit. At the same time, if I think about sort of like meeting that objective, you could make an argument that the activity or the piece that we do to measure the learning on that first objective is relatively summative to that objective, but formative to the whole day. So, it's okay to sort of like see these things as sort of blurry. Something that is summative to day one is formative to the chapter or to the unit or to the year. So it's really these terms are dependent on making sure that we're looking at a clearly defined time context or learning sequence context. So yeah, there's some certainly some gradient between the two. Right. So for next time, I want to look at some additional planning pieces that we can start to fold into our lesson plans and start to think about how to make a better and more in-depth lesson plan. I also want to sort of tie this out now from just day one into day two, into day three, and then making sure that there's a continuous narrative between all of these rather than just being sort of like discrete points where day one has nothing to do with day two, has nothing to do with day three. We want to fit these things together and have that continuity piece. And then start to talk about instructional methodologies and how we can pick instructional pieces that make sense. Those are the three things that we're going to talk about for next time. If you have any questions, by all means, let me know, contact me, or let me know in class. Thanks.